I'll start broad and we'll narrow it down from here. So I think everybody here knows that global climate change is happening and the news is bad. We're seeing increasing temperatures, we're seeing increasing sea levels, and with that, we're seeing an increase in the probability or the potential for extreme events, both the intensity and the frequency of that. And so, it's a big question is, how is all this climate change impacting coastal systems? And there's a lot of things that we need to consider when we try to address that question. So species ranges are changing in response to changing climatic conditions. The interactions between these new species and the existing species are changing, or the interactions between native species are changing. The functioning of the systems is changing. And so what I'm really going to focus on today is the temporal properties of ecosystems, really thinking a lot about variability and resistance to perturbations and resilience, recovery rates following perturbations. And my story today, I've divided this into 4 parts. So the first one is kind of a meta-analysis that derives from some of my work on tropical cyclones. And then I'm going to talk about 3 quick case studies. So one is about tropical cyclones, resilience, and coastal fish. The second one is on resistance and resilience, tropical cyclones and coastal rivers along climatic gradients. And then the last one is going to be closer to home, talking about seagrass and those communities in the Chesapeake Bay. So starting with the first one, tropical cyclones. The IPCC predicts that we are going to be seeing increases in the occurrence of strong storms, so category 4 and 5 storms. Rainfall rates are projected to increase with climate change and warming. And the areas that are being affected are changing. So we're getting more poleward migration. And then interestingly, at the same time, the frequency of cyclones in certain parts of the world may actually be declining despite all of these other things that are happening. So a lot of change occurring with the intensity, frequency, and nature of tropical cyclones. And all of this is happening in coastal regions, which is a problem because there's a lot of people that live along the coast. And we're projected to see a 35% increase in coastal populations over the next century. So that's all stuff that's supposed to happen in the future, but really this is stuff that's happening now. We are already in a warming world. That stormier future that's been predicted it's already starting to materialize. And anecdotally, you can see this in recent major events like the impact of Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico in 2017, the devastating 1,000-year floods in North Carolina with Hurricane Helene, the record-breaking rapid intensification of Hurricane Milton in the Gulf in 2024, although fortunately that kind of petered out a bit before it made landfall. And then, not too far in the past, Hurricane Sandy, which was kind of unusual in where it occurred and the big impacts it had on the Northeast. So anecdotally, we're seeing these effects. If you look at the data, the damage being caused by storms has definitely been increasing in the United States. The cumulative damage worldwide is rapidly increasing. And the cumulative deaths worldwide has also been increasing, although not at the same rate because of increases in our sort of forecasting and warning systems. And I usually get a question about this graph about, well, what is this huge jump? That was a single event Bola cyclone, low-lying islands in India, which were swamped. It came in the night. There was no warning, and the mortality was pretty astounding. And so you can look at these graphs and say, well, coastal development could be a factor here because there's more people living along the coastline. But the evidence is definitely sort of tending towards a lot of this is also coming from the increased storm strength. So these events are becoming the norm. They're not even really outliers anymore, and it's going to continue to get worse. So what does that mean for aquatic systems? And I wanted to point out here that it's not just tropical cyclones that's intensifying. We're seeing other kinds of floods. We're seeing fires. We're seeing these heat dome events and heat waves. So lots of things are happening all at the same time because of all this global climate change. So my story, in terms of when I got involved with this line of questions and research, dates back to 2017. So that was a pretty busy hurricane season. That's what we call tropical cyclones in this hemisphere. There was Harvey, Irma, and Maria, all happening within that season. And I was in Texas at the time, in an area that was impacted by Hurricane Harvey. And I think it's worth bringing up when we talk about extreme events that there's some problems in the literature. When it comes to tropical cyclones, at least in 2017, our overarching understanding of how and why ecosystems respond to these events was pretty limited. And that's because a lot of the studies are opportunistic and they occur in disaster zones. So people don't really have time to plan out good studies in advance. And a lot of times the data is not awesome. And we're oftentimes lacking controls in time and space. So I want to give an example of, if anyone here was at the ASLO meeting in 2019, there was this was after the 2017 season, had a special session on the effects of storm events on aquatic and coastal systems. There were 38 talks, 2 full days. I sat through all of them, and it was really kind of boring because every talk was the same talk. It was, this is where I work. This is the hurricane that I'm studying. This is what happened. This is how long the recovery took, or maybe it's still recovering, or ran out of funding, and we don't know how things shook out. And so these case studies are very useful, but they also don't really advance our generalized understanding. They're just lots and lots of examples, and that's what most of the tropical cyclone literature is. And so it's something that me and my collaborators have taken to calling my system, my storm stories. And so where I was, though, in 2017, there were a lot of coastal and marine scientists. It kind of happened at the perfect place. UTMSI is there, Texas A&M University Corpus Christi is there, Mission Aransas Nears is there. And so at the time we said, this is a great opportunity to answer this basic question. Well, what happened and why did it happen to these particular coastal systems in aggregate? So a number of us received rapid funding from the National Science Foundation, and we decided to pool our data and try to answer these questions. And so just to give you a rundown for this early synthesis, what we had lots of data from barrier islands, estuaries, especially in coastal rivers, and then lots of different response types, from the hydrologic and hydrographic, biogeochemical, mobile biota, fish, the physical environment, all these different things were represented. And when we put all the data together in a common currency, one of the things that popped out is that we saw clusters. So when we looked at the relationship between the return time in days and the log response ratio, which is kind of like effect size, we definitely saw that across systems, and that's what the different shapes are, the types, like the biogeochemical responses, the physical responses, they tended to cluster. So across systems, we saw similar responses within types. And so that got us thinking that, maybe there is some generalizability here that we could extend to other examples and case studies. And what we did there in that effort was, that's the kind of thing where you've heard people calling for more monitoring global efforts to be able to do precisely that kind of work. And I think that is important, but there's also a lot of opportunity for synthesis using meta-analysis, because there's all those case studies that are out there, and on their own, individually, maybe they don't tell us a lot, but maybe they can tell us more when you start putting them all together. So starting with that 2017 hurricane season, I connected with a colleague at University of New Hampshire, Bill McDowell, who's working in Puerto Rico, and John Kamenowski at FIU, who's looking at Irma, and actually also had a project looking at Harvey. NSF was good enough to give us money to hold kind of like a scoping planning workshop in Corpus Christi in 2019. So we had 42 people that came to that meeting, and we did a lot of data sharing in terms of data stories, like my system, my storm, 5-minute talks. We started developing conceptual models, and then we started trying to pull together the collective data to look for patterns and try to infer some process. And we looked at a lot of different things. So we were considering the effect of winds and freshwater inundation and storm surge, how far you are from the eye wall, the orientation in relation to the eye wall, the timing of the event, the antecedent conditions, the evolutionary history of the organisms, speed of the storm track, frequency at which events are occurring in that place and impact communities. And I just wanted to give a few examples of why some of this stuff is so important when you start putting data together. So one of them is timing. So why does timing matter? Well, this is a local example. We had Hurricane Agnes, actually it was Tropical Storm Agnes when it came across the Chesapeake. That was a really weird storm because it was early. That was June, it came across. Record amounts of rainfall in the upper Chesapeake Bay watershed, highest flows ever recorded over the Conowingo Dam. And for seagrasses and SAV, it was pretty devastating. And we usually don't see these kind of impacts from storms, but this one was kind of unique where we had a huge crash. The upper bay was buried in lots of sediment, and the lower bay was hit with freshwater lens that floated out and killed a lot of the marine life, including the seagrass. And why it was so impactful was because seed production for a lot of the species hadn't even occurred yet. And so if it had been in October or November, it wouldn't have been such a big deal, but it was a huge deal because of when it occurred. Here's another example for the evolutionary history question. So this is an anolis lizard that's hanging on for dear life in high winds. And this has been a great model system. This is a paper, graph from a paper by Colin Donahue that shows that these lizards actually, they show adaptations. The islands that get hit more frequently by storms, they tend to have larger toe pads and they can hang on better in those high winds, which is pretty cool. Here's an example about frequency. So this is comparing nitrate loads in two streams. One's in Puerto Rico in the top panel, and the other one is from Taiwan, a comparable tropical forest. What you can see is that, in the upper graph, following two storms, there's a big change in the nitrate load that takes several years to come back to normal. In the lower one, you don't really see that kind of effect. And the big difference between these systems is that the Puerto Rican forest doesn't get hit all that frequently by storms, whereas the Taiwanese system has a much richer history of impacts by tropical cyclones. And the folks that are working there think that it's basically it's got nowhere to go. It's most of the nitrate has been exported. There isn't that kind of impact that you see. So the workshop ended up developing a conceptual model based around these two properties of time series. One, return time, and the other effect size. So, and these relate to resistance and resilience. So we definitely thought that the storm strength was important, and that's governed by all these kind of characteristics of the storm. And then we came up with this idea that systems have some kind of average susceptibility, typical susceptibility, their typical resilience, typical resistance. And that's going to be constrained by things like the kind of animals that live there and their life history traits and the attributes of the ecosystems, and maybe also the frequency of the storm regime. But then at the time of the event itself, the resistance and resilience might be different than the long-term average. Because of antecedent conditions. So if it was a drought year, or if there was a storm that happened just before the previous storm, things like that could impact the current resistance and resilience of the system. And then these things would interact with storm strength to govern how the system responds. And then ecosystem connectivity, we thought also might matter because it has to do with how rapidly the organisms can come back after an event. And then we made it more complicated by adding the humans. So when you start factoring in the built environment, land use, socioeconomic systems in parallel, we thought they might have similar kind of responses. You can see that we've built a rather alarmingly complicated conceptual model. But this was our idea of how we thought everything fit together. This was published in a bioscience paper back in 2020. So following up on that, we put together a research coordination network called HERS. And these are all the folks that are involved with the HERS network. And we're winding down. The funding wraps up in December. But and one of the things that we did is we put together a lot of data. And so data from the 2019 workshop included about 4,000 plus time series from a bunch of different storms, not just the 2017 storms, but other storms as well, from across the United States and the Caribbean. And we had a lot of data from estuarine waters. That was the bulk of the data, but a variety of other systems were represented as well. And again, while we do have a lot of saltwater systems, we also had some terrestrial wetland and freshwater systems in there, and a lot of different response variables. And so we're looking at all of these different responses we grouped them into these categories of biogeochemistry, hydrography, mobile organisms, sedentary fauna, non-mobile fauna, and vascular plants. And so we had to come up with some way to compare all this in a common currency. And so in order to be included in the data set, it had to be a real time series that you could collapse into some information. And the information we were after was how the system responded to the effect size. So how much did the variable change after the storm? And then how long did it take to come back to normal? So these are the two things that we were really focused on. And so in order to be included, the researchers that were giving us the data, they had to be able to calculate these metrics based on baseline or seasonal variation in the system. And so that effect size, we then calculated as this log response ratio. And the observed resistance, we calculated as a variation on that effect size divided by the strength of the stressor. And the resilience was kind of expressed as a rate. So based on how long did it take to come back divided by the number of days, so like the rate of return. And this is our concept map for how we think all this fits together. So these blue circles are the intrinsic properties of the system, the ones that we can't actually measure. So these latent variables, and then these boxes are observed characteristics. And so armed with that, we put all the data together, and this was the big sort of outcome of this initial data synthesis. And so what we observed is that the resistance of these systems to wind and to rainfall negatively covaried with the calculated resilience of these systems. And it was a pattern that was repeated across different ecosystems and across different variables. And it was very robust to the different ways we looked at it. And when we collapsed the data for those systems that we had multiple groups represented with enough replication, we saw this pattern also repeated, this resistance versus resilience, like within freshwater and wetland systems among different response types. Okay, so that was pretty interesting for a data set this size to come up with something that clean. And we came up with the idea that evolution is probably the best explanation for what we're seeing. So it's hard to be good at everything. You get, for example, K versus R selected species. In meta-community theory, there's the computation versus colonization trade-off. And so if you can't be good at everything, you're probably going to be better at either being like more of like a fast colonizer, a weedy species, like more high resilience, or one of these more dominant kind of climax species, high resistance. So borrowing some ideas from the classic succession theory. And so that evolution explanation, that would explain why patterns in the fauna and the flora would follow that. And we've seen in the literature, there's a few examples of people, like this is a paper from Bellingham looking at a storm in Jamaica and trees. And he had some different terminology, but saw a similar pattern of covariation between this resistant and resilient taxa. And then this is some bottle experiments that were done just looking at similar questions. And again, you see the negative covariation. So we're not the first people to observe this, but I think we were the first people to see this on this scale with this kind of data. So the other question is, well, why would you get ecosystem processes falling in line with this? And we think that there's probably a biodiversity ecosystem function type explanation there, that if the functions are in fact dependent on the fauna and the flora, and the fauna and the flora are following this kind of pattern, the functions probably would follow this as well. So our general conclusion from this first meta-analysis was that we see this general pattern that I think might be another one of these sort of pretty good generalizable rules in ecology or laws in ecology, that the systems definitely tend to be either more resistant or more resilient, and that's probably a selection pressure. And that management for both may not be feasible in most situations. So, having developed this concept, it's worth asking the question: how does this playing out in specific systems under climate change stress? And do these concepts that are sort of in aggregate in this giant meta-analysis, do they transfer to individual case studies and examples? So here's one, the first of three I'm going to show you. So in this case study, we're looking at coastal fishes. So they're highly diverse. There's lots of different kinds of functions. The composition varies from place to place. And there's a lot of good monitoring data, which again lends itself to meta-analysis. So this was work by my postdoc, Henny Hensel. So these locations, these dots on the map, these are places where there's good long-term fish trawl abundance data. And so there's 40 of them. There's monthly data. The data ranges from 1979 to 2019. There's about 20 years of data per site that was included in the analysis. And what we did is we intersected the storm tracks of all the storms that impacted the bays during that monitoring period to generate this data set of event impacts for each one of these locations. There's about 400 different species in the data set, and we were able to calculate from the trawl data a number of different metrics about these communities or these observations. So estimates of biomass and abundance, diversity, richness, functional diversity, all these things that we were able to put together with all the species data. And then when we matched those with the storms, we were able to come up with some basic metrics from some of the NOAA storm track data. It's like wind speed, rainfall, total energy, things like that. And then because we've got time series from the trawl data, we could start calculating some of these things like the effect size, the resistance, the return time, and the resilience. So kind of building a data set similar to the previous one, but focused specifically on one group, fish. So one of the things that we saw is that the resilience tended to increase with the number of different fish species present in a bay system. So not a great relationship, but definitely a relationship there. We also saw that resistance tends to increase with species richness, and neither of these things are surprising. The diversity function literature sort of predicts that these patterns should exist. But we also saw some evidence for perhaps a relationship with the frequency of storms, that resilience appears to be generally higher in the systems that get hit more frequently by tropical storms. When we put all this together into a structural equation model, what we see is that the frequency of storms has a direct effect on the resilience of the system, and then also is impacting the diversity of organisms that are present, which then has cascading effects through to the resistance and resilience of the system. So storm frequency seems to be a pretty important variable in this system. And the communities that are more resilient tend to be composed of a couple of families. So the shad and herring, the croaker, drum, and trout, cyanids, and the anchovies are the groups that are most common in the sites that have higher resilience, that recover quickly after these tropical storms. And these are the ones that also are being somewhat filtered by the storm frequency. Another group that were involved with this, Brian James and Rolando Santos at FIU, were interested in the functional diversity of these systems. So they looked at diversity before and after on average across these different ecoregions. And what they found is a generalized pattern of as storm frequency increases, the change in post-storm functional diversity also increases. So the systems become more diverse following storms if they are more frequently hit by storms. So putting this together, this case study demonstrates something that I think is pretty well established in the literature, that diversity does enhance community recovery. But interestingly here, hurricane frequency appears to act as a resiliency filter. So it does appear to select for more resilient and less resistant species. And the resilient communities show an ability to sort of expand the functional diversity of the community following these perturbations, kind of filling in the gaps. And this is significant in a world where the climate is changing, because we are going to be seeing perhaps more storms or stronger storms in some of these areas. And this kind of gives a preview of how these drivers might reshape the identity of the systems. So we're seeing that stress here is selecting for taxa that optimize towards resilience at the expense of resistance. So then let's look at case study number 2. So I'm going to switch systems completely, and we're going to talk about rainfall rather than storms, at least at first. So these are some maps of potential rainfall distributions in the future from the EPA. It's expected that annual mean precipitation is going to change worldwide. Some places are going to get wetter, some are going to get drier. And coastal rivers and estuaries are very sensitive to rainfall and changes in precipitation. And so I started looking at this when I was a professor in Texas back in 2016. I was really curious how the rainfall patterns were going to affect or drive the structure and function of the communities. In the context of this talk, I'm going to specifically ask the question, well, how does this affect the resistance and resilience of the communities in the coastal rivers, particularly if we're considering a scenario where things are going to get drier, as they are predicted to in the Southwest. So this is a conceptual diagram of how rainfall affects structure and function of riverine systems. And you can see there's a lot going on there. But we've got precipitation at the top because it drives both the flow regime and also the riparian vegetation. And those two things cascade down through the system to the organisms and all the different functions. Now, this is a really challenging thing to study because you can't manipulate rainfall at watershed scales. So experiments are kind of out. And you can go to observational data, but there's big gradients in rainfall that exist. They cover large distances, and they have lots of covariant factors that are hard to disentangle. However, where I was in Texas, this isn't a problem because there's a really remarkable rainfall gradient that occurs in Texas throughout the state, but then getting compressed down here in the coastal bend. So focusing here in the area where I was working, it goes from semi-arid to subhumid in a remarkably short distance, so about 55 to 135 centimeters per year. And you can see the landscape just drastically changes. And so that's a rate of about a quarter centimeter per kilometer, so very fast. And the temperature gradient along that same distance doesn't really change. So air temperature is pretty similar. Water temperature is also pretty similar. And it's historically understudied. So we've got lots of data from the upper part of the coastal bend, but not a whole lot of data from lower down in the coastal bend. So we couldn't find any data in 2015. And so we kind of started our data set from scratch. And we had a number of different projects that were funded looking at this system, including funding from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and also the National Science Foundation. And so we had 5 good years of data comprising 211 sampling events. And this includes synoptic samples of fish, invertebrates, water quality, nutrients, and habitat, and also data on things like dissolved oxygen, temperature, light, flow. And streams look very different as you move from the more semi-arid to the subhumid systems. So a little bit of background information on what we see across the gradient. As you go from drier to wetter, variation and variability goes down, seasonality and predictability goes up. So we've got some big changes along those factors. The composition of the organisms changes quite a bit. The invertebrates and the fish, we get very different communities as you move from the dry side to the wet side of the gradient. The abundance of top predators and the food chain length increases as you go to the wetter part of the gradient. And this is some work that's hopefully going to be coming out soon. The productivity is tightly tied to rainfall. So we see decreasing production in fishes and invertebrates. That's what I'm showing here along the top. In a lot of these systems, biomass going down, definitely in total, largely being driven by benthic invertebrates. But the P to B, so the production to biomass ratio, it's going down in fish while it's going up in invertebrates, in the benthos, and going down in snag invertebrates. And we also see changes in interannual variability in production across the gradient. So I think what I really want to communicate here is that this is a hugely important gradient. So the amount of rainfall these systems get make a lot of different changes occur. And so, armed with that data, we can look at how a single event, Hurricane Harvey, which happened right in the middle of our rainfall gradient, but it affected a number of our sites. How did the hurricane interact with that climatic gradient? And so this is one of our study sites along the center of the gradient. You can see this massive debris dam. This whole system was really strongly impacted by these storms. So this is some work that another postdoc of mine, Bradley Strickland, really worked up. This plot here is showing the richness relationship. And so you can see that it goes up following the storm, then goes back down and sort of settles out. This settling point is pretty consistent with the long-term average. So we see this kind of post-storm decline followed by a bump on average across the sites. And that bump was kind of delayed by a few months. So the communities crashed, then boomed, then they settled back down again. And the composition of the communities also follows this sort of trajectory. And in this recovery period, the bump period, you ended up with a community that was pretty different than the ones that were the long term. So there's some opportunists coming in and taking advantage. When we looked across the gradient, though, one of the things that was pretty interesting is that the size of this deviation, the size of this bump, was related to the annual average rainfall of these systems. So the ones that were wetter tended to have more organic matter falling in, and we think that drove a larger bump in the productivity following the event. So there's definitely a effect of the climate, the rainfall on this aspect of recovery. When you look at the initial response, this is another kind of complicated figure. This is a structural equation model showing for the abundance of organisms, benthic organisms, we have rainfall, the average rainfall, we have this rainfall associated with the storm, we have the magnitude and the duration of the flood, and then we have the log response ratio, the effect size, and the return time, how long it took to come back. So this is from a paper that was published in the Journal of Animal Ecology last year. And what you can see is that obviously more rainfall with the storm, bigger floods, and floods do have an impact on the effect size. But rainfall, the long-term rainfall, dampens the flood magnitude. So what we're seeing is that organisms in the mesic sites just tended to have higher resistance for no other reason than the fact that the storms were not as severe, or the storm effects were not as severe. You tended to have these hydrographs that looked much more sort of moderate, whereas in the arid sites, you had these very spiky or flashy floods. So that was one mechanism by which the long-term climate, which is shifting, impacted how these systems responded to a perturbation. But then the other thing that was interesting is if you looked at the diversity of the organisms, there was a direct effect of the annual rainfall on the effect size, so dampening the effect size. And so what we're seeing is that the arid sites, they are organisms that tend to have rapid reproduction, high dispersal, short generation time, high turnover. And the mesic sites are characterized by organisms that tend to live longer and have lower dispersal ability. And so there's a direct effect of the climate sort of altering the identity of the community and changing how it responds to perturbation mediated through the traits of the organisms. So one, from this case study, rainfall in and of itself, the annual average, is a big driver of structure and function in coastal rivers. And as rainfall increases, we observed increases in resistance and decreases in resilience. They're driven by changes in the resident taxa and the hydrology. And so kind of like encapsulating that, the stress of aridity tends to select for taxa that optimize towards resilience at the expense of resistance, but that does gear them towards being better suited to dealing with perturbations or recovering from perturbations like this hurricane that went through the system. All right, I've got one last case study I wanted to talk about before I wrap things up. Chesapeake Bay. So we're going close to home here. For those who follow the Chesapeake Bay, and I know Dick Zimmerman, I think, is still in the audience. 2019, this was a very bad year for SAV in the Chesapeake Bay. It's the largest decline we've ever had, both in terms of the area lost and the percent SAV, or submerged aquatic vegetation, that was lost. And this was the first survey that I put out as the director, so it was fitting. So my first survey, I had bad news for everybody. But when we dug into the data, we saw that in the upper bay, the tidal fresh and the Ligurian, not so bad. We didn't really have any losses up there. And we saw losses in the middle bay and the lower bay, so the mesohaline and the polyhaline, but especially in the middle bay, the mesohaline. We had these huge losses. So what is that going on? And how does this relate back to what I've been talking about this whole time? Well, this is a graph of bay-wide Zostra area up through this crash. And so there's been a general pattern of trending downward, although you can see that we were on an upward trajectory in these last years of the 20 teens. And these declines were driven largely by heat stress and increasing average temperature, so, and water quality. So there's lots of things that are stressing Zostra out, but heat has been a big one. And regardless of the cause, eelgrass has definitely been in sort of a slow, steady decline, at least over this mid-1990s up through the sort of 2010, 2015 kind of period, with heat stress impacting it along the way. At the same time, this green line, this is widgeon grass, or Rupia maritima. And you can see there's a spike here in the early 2000s, and then it just really starts to take off in these mid 20 teens. So it's been going up, up, up. And I don't think that people were even really taking close note of that when it was happening. It just sort of snuck up on everyone that like Rupia has been like increasing rapidly. So when you actually graph out the proportion of bay-wide SAV that's attributable to eelgrass in the blue and Rupia or widgeon grass in the green, remarkably, everybody likes to think about eelgrass as being the dominant species in the Chesapeake Bay, and it was when the survey started in 1984. About half of the reported grass area was eelgrass, but that's not the case today. And in 2018, right before the crash, the eelgrass had come down to close to 20%, and the widgeon grass was up to about 45% of the SAV in the Chesapeake Bay. So widgeon grass had become this incredibly important species. And that big crash we saw in 2019, that was widgeon grass too. So we had this trajectory of increasing, followed by this huge crash. And at least 60% of the loss was just a few massive widgeon grass beds that just collapsed. And so one thing that became really apparent when we dug into the data is that we had become, for our annual numbers, we become very dependent on widgeon grass. And in doing so, we became very dependent on the fluctuations in widgeon grass. If it goes up, it's a good year. If it goes down, it's a bad year. So what drives fluctuations in widgeon grass as compared to eelgrass? Well, this is work from another postdoc of mine, Mark Hensel's PNAS paper from 2023. And this structural equation model shows all the different things that we think matter. But what's most important here is temperature and salinity, mediated through a couple different factors. Eelgrass is affected by water quality, no doubt about that. But the monotonic increases in temperature and the periodic spikes in temperature have been a bigger impact. And so the heat stress has been a huge problem for eelgrass, whereas the water quality changes, perhaps less so. Widgeon grass is totally different. Widgeon grass is not really affected by heat. We couldn't find any evidence for that, but it is sure dependent on water quality or water parameters. So springtime salinity, which is kind of a proxy for freshwater inflow, and springtime chlorophyll A have a huge impact. And so, we can interpret these data to tell us that when you get a really wet spring, which crashes the salinity and brings a lot of nutrients into the system, you tend to lose the widgeon grass. So it collapses rapidly. And we've actually seen this a few times over the past 40 years, but never to this extent, because we never had this much widgeon grass before. And this is from another exploration of temporal properties of the different grasses in the bay. what I'm showing you here is that in the upper bay, you tend to see as synchrony increases, variability increases. That's what you tend to expect to see in meadows, in diverse meadows. In the lower bay, it actually is not the case. We either get no relationship, or you might interpret this as a negative relationship between synchrony across meadows and overall variability. You're getting portfolio effects in the upper bay. You're not seeing these in the lower bay. And the reason for that is in the lower bay, we've got this very stable and synchronous, going up and down in tandem, eelgrass meadows. And the places where you have widgeon grass, especially in the mesohaline, they're extremely asynchronous and they're extremely unstable. And this really kind of underscores this description of widgeon grass as a boom bust species. So let's look at some more comparisons between the two species. Widgeon grass has a 10-year seed bank, which allows it to come back from seeds years after it's disappeared. It reproduces months after germination all summer long. It's got a really wide salinity and temperature tolerance, but it has very high light needs. It's got a short growth form that's poor for ecosystem engineering. It tends to be kind of ephemeral, and it's easily outcompeted, except in stressful habitats where it's the only one that's doing well. Eelgrass, on the other hand, no seed bank. Around here, it doesn't produce until the second year. Synchronized seed production. It's got narrower tolerances for salinity and temperature. Its light needs are moderate. It grows taller. It's more perennial. And it tends to be more dominant within its physiological range. So, this is kind of like more of our climax type species, whereas the widgeon grass is more of our sort of weedy early successional species. But somehow this early successional species came to dominate a large area within the Chesapeake Bay, something that historically I don't think we ever had. And so what we think is going on here is that climate warming, which has been driving decreases in zostera and also a retreat in zostera area from where we had it in the 60s and earlier, has been transitioning in the Middle Bay from a eelgrass dominated system to a widgeon grass dominated system. And widgeon grass tends to have high resilience. It can bounce back and expand rapidly, but it's got pretty low resistance to perturbations, to water quality. And so I think this is another example of climate stress restructuring communities towards one of these optimization zones, high resilience. All right, so the commonalities between the case studies I just walked through are that, I think that these all to some extent involve climate change. So whether it's rainfall, temperature, or storm frequency, and in all cases, we're talking about changes in the identity of the organisms, and that affects the resistance and resilience of these organisms. And that as stress increases and as these systems are in transition, we tend to see taxa tending towards higher resilience and lower resistance. And that repeated pattern matches with the generalized negative covariation pattern that I presented at the beginning in the meta-analysis. So putting this all together, the thesis I've been building here is that this ramping up of press and pulse disturbances with climate change are preferentially selecting for weedy species. So higher resilience at the expense of community resistance. And so with this kind of change, we're seeing the world, I think, is being turned into a garden of weeds. And with that, some of the consequences are, I suspect that we're going to continue to see increases in the variability of the delivery of ecosystem services, but perhaps an increased capacity for rapid recovery. Maybe not recovery of the things we want to recover, but of biomass recovery, of some kind of ecosystem recovery, as we favor these species that's what they're well suited for: growing quickly, spreading rapidly, recolonizing quickly. So I wanted to close by just talking briefly about management. So we oftentimes talk about coastal management in terms of managing for both resistance and resilience, but I hope that I've convinced you that that may not always be feasible in a lot of situations. So what should we be managing for? And I think this is kind of an interesting question because it's the same question that populations are facing when they are when you think about selection pressure. So when you think about the intensity of an event versus the frequency of the event, low intensity, low frequency disturbance should be dominated by more resistant dominant species, whereas high intensity, high frequency disturbance should be dominated by more resilient weedy species. These two zones here are the places where it's really unclear of what's going to be better, what's the right type of characteristic to be managing for. And I don't have an answer, but I do think a few things to consider are, so the context matters. So when you think about which species we're managing for, what are the generation times relative to the disturbance frequencies now and in the future? What's the potential resistance capacity relative to the disturbance intensity now and in the future? And what's the efficiency of the various strategies in comparison to the competitors? So these are some of the factors that we need to be thinking about as we think about which kinds of species, which kinds of marsh plants or mangroves or benthic organisms we should be trying to manage for if we're going to try to get into this kind of management at all. So my final thoughts are, again, this is a now problem. We are seeing it now. The baseline conditions are rapidly changing. The frequency of extreme events are changing. We're seeing changes in the structure and function of these systems that we're studying in real time. And I think that a generalized repeated pattern is that these stressors are creating more resilient populations, more resilient communities, but we're losing some of the dependability, the resistance that we would like to see in terms of dependable annual provisioning of services. And then, more broadly, these are complicated questions, and mechanisms really important. And so this kind of work of comparing systems and trying to isolate these drivers across spatial and temporal scales is it's really important, and it's going to continue to become more important as these changes occur. Because what we think we know about systems is probably wrong now, and it's going to get more wrong as the climate changes. So, what the historical data can tell us is going to become more and more limited as we enter this kind of new world of new normals and new disturbance frequencies. So I need to give a huge thank you to folks in my lab, the mapping program, and all the different sources of data and funding. And I also need to give a huge shout out to all the collaborators on the hurricane work. Lots of different folks, lots of different organizations participated in that work over the years. And finally, I can't close this talk out without giving a shout out for the upcoming benthic ecology meeting, which is going to be really close to ODU. It's going to be at Virginia Beach at the Cavalier Resort in March of 2026. So if you are a BEM person or somebody who's maybe thinking about going to the Marine Benthic Ecology meeting, registration is going to open next week. The meeting's going to be in your backyard. I encourage you to join us.